All right, we can go ahead and get started.
So I'm gonna introduce Erin, and then she can talk about what she has to present. So Erin, she's a fourth-year PhD student. She's working with Thorsten Becker. She got a bachelor degree in Oklahoma State University in 2018, and then afterwards she joined UT and also UTIG. And she is working mostly in global mantle convection and global plate tectonics dynamics and modeling. And so today she's going to present part of her first paper. And so we are looking forward to listen to Erin. Welcome, and get it away, Erin.
Thanks, Simone. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about some recent work that's ended up being going to be my first publication for my PhD. It's a little interesting because this wasn't exactly a project that I set out to do at all. It just kind of happened while I was doing some 2D testing, looking at like viscosity and different types of heating in these 2D convection models. I saw this sort of like the main figure for the paper showing this subduction termination from a mantle plume. So I just kind of saw it in my models and I thought, that's interesting. And then I showed it to Thorsten, my advisor, and he's like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. So just kind of popped up out of nowhere. But I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about it today. So as like an intro and a refresher for most of you guys, mantle plumes in geodynamic modeling, they essentially come from the thermal boundary layer at the bottom, the core mantle boundary. They're essentially thermal upwellings that come up from the surface when you have sort of instabilities, whether they're from LLSVPs or ULVZs. There is a sort of chemical component to these as well, but for at least my modeling, we're kind of ignoring the chemical component and mostly focusing on them as sort of a thermal instability that comes out of this bottom boundary. It's typically thought that they can be triggered by sort of subduction of crustal material that hits that core mantle boundary and can kind of like slide into the edge of one of these LSVPs and cause that upwelling. So sort of showing through time, this is kind of the classic plume head while it's rising. When it hits one of these sort of phase transitions, there can be a deflection of it. You might get some sort of return flow, or it will make its way all the way to the surface where it can be either a hotspot or and lead to like hotspot tracks and things like that. So that's the basic, description of plumes and for how I modeled them. Some other cases that use sort of mantle plumes in geodynamic modeling. This paper from Balmer et al. That's looking at mantle plume modeling in the case of the Hawaiian emperor chain. So looking at how crustal movement on the top can end up giving you, a hotspot track or things like that. And maybe the main way that mantle plumes are modeled in geodynamic modeling are for subduction initiation. So here you have a mantle plume rising into that top thermal boundary layer, and you see this these sort of edges happen along the mantle plume that then develop into full subduction zones once sort of the slabs are then heavy enough to initiate that sort of slab pull. So what I'm doing, I'm using Aspect, which is a mantle convection code, stands for Advanced Solver for Problems in Earth's Convection. It's an open source mantle convection code. It's a finite element code that's sort of built on Deal 2, so it's a little bit separate from how the code deals with some of the partial differential equations and setup of the mesh. One of the sort of special strong points of Aspect is that it uses this adaptive mesh refinement, which is kind of shown in its logo here. So you can essentially prescribe your mesh to refine in places where you have like temperature or viscosity contrasts, so that you'll have a finer resolved mesh in those areas. And then in areas where you have less active advection or flow, you can have a coarser mesh, which is helpful when you're trying to model very small scale things or just in general for computational speed. So it solves the basic equations of convection, so conservation of mass, momentum, and energy. It is a dimensional code, so all of the data that I'll be showing is in the actual units, so it's can be helpful for when you're doing things that are sort of comparable to Earth. You get realistic temperatures, pressures, things like that. And it was originally designed for mantle convection modeling, but nowadays it's used pretty much for any type of modeling from inner core to crustal lithosphere dynamics. But I use it for its intended purpose, which is sort of large global scale mantle convection. So one of the important parts of what I've added to this model is something we call damage rheology. And it's essentially a mechanism to describe rock deformation and reactivation in mantle convection by combining strain weakening and strain healing. And so this is sort of the paper where this idea comes from and the implementation that I use. It's Fuchs and Becker 2019. So here it's shown in the case of a subduction zone. So you have an active subduction zone that is then sort of shut off, but you'll have this kernel of damage in the crust that can be advected over time and lead to reactivation. So it's essentially keeping weaknesses in the crust that allow you to kind of use them for reactivation and things like that. And so the strain healing portion of it looks like this. So where this is your second invariant of the strain rate tensor. This gamma is going to be your accumulated damage, which is a non-dimensional parameter. It's just giving you an idea of sort of what's happening with the strain. The A is going to be your time scale for strain healing, and E is a non-dimensional activation energy. And so it's essentially saying with time and enough applied temperature, you can heal that damage. So it essentially means that you don't end up with lots of accumulated strain in the mantle, but you will in the crust where it's cooler, and that can be held onto for a longer time. So how it all works in Aspect is you compute the viscosity. In our case, we're using an Arrhenius temperature dependent viscosity, which basically is temperature and depth dependent. It will calculate the stress magnitude and the strain rate in whatever particle you're in, and then calculate the strain weakening that's there, and then apply that strain healing. And then because this is a viscoplastic model, we apply plastic yielding to it, so it will rescale your viscosity if it's past that yield stress. And then we limit our viscosity from input parameters, giving it sort of a minimum and a maximum, so that essentially if you have too large viscosity variations in this kind of modeling, it gets very sort of clunky computationally and it's harder for the model to sort of solve those equations. So we just kind of give it a minimum of 1 × 10⁻¹8 and a maximum of 2.5 × 10⁻24. So what does the model look like? We're doing 2D models in a quarter of an annulus. So it's essentially you took a circle out of the middle of the Earth and then cut that circle into a quarter. That's what we're looking at. So we have a realistic crust to core mantle boundary depth at about 3,000 kilometers. And the only things we are really prescribing in this model is the temperature on the bottom boundary and the temperature on the top boundary. So 273 Kelvin on the top, 2,573 Kelvin on the bottom. We don't have any internal heating in our model because we're trying to look at essentially these mantle plume interactions. And so if you had a model with just internal heating, you wouldn't get any mantle plumes produced. And we know the Earth is somewhere sort of in between these two regimes, so some form of mixed heating, but we just decided to ignore the internal heating component while we're looking at these plume interactions. And so our model is all oceanic crust composition. Just to sort of keep it simple, we haven't implemented any continental crust or anything in it. And we have an imposed viscosity jump at the 660 phase transition, which is this difference here. So we're showing viscosity, so you end up having a lower viscosity in your lower mantle versus your asthenosphere, which we think is pretty true to how the Earth is as well. So what do our models look like in action? So this is sort of a sped up temperature look at our Mantle convection models. So you can see you have plumes coming up from your bottom boundary. You have subduction happening. We have essentially periods of this mobility where you have a subduction zone into periods of stagnant lid where you see your top layer thickening over time and your mantle heating up until eventually the crust breaks and you get a subduction zone, which then cools down the mantle. And this sort of happens in cycles throughout our model. And so you also see those sort of drippy, lower crustal things that are also kind of a hallmark of stagnant lid convection as well. So yeah, and we ran our models until 15 billion years in model time because we're trying to look at also the time dependency of the model and looking at these sort of cycles of subduction and stagnant lid and what it essentially means for our models over time. So we basically ran two types of models for this that gave us sort of episodic models in this first case. So the only thing we changed in between the two models that I'm going to show is the yield stress in the lithosphere. So for this first model, it's set to 65 MPa. And here is showing a time series of heat flow over model time. So you can see periods where you have stagnant lid, the heat flow will decrease really strongly because the crust isn't broken at all, so there's no way for the heat to escape out of the model. And when you have this break in the crust, you'll have a spike in the heat flow. And then this is what it looks like when there's subduction happening. And so this happens in cycles throughout the model. It's like every 1.5 to 2 billion years, you'll have this sort of episodicity that happens. And then the red dashed lines are showing where you have those plume-driven subduction terminations. And so out of the 8 sort of cycles that we see in our model, we see roughly 8 of them, 8 of these terminations, because in this section we had terminations, but the convection started again. So it won't happen every single time that the subduction zone shuts off, but it does happen consistently throughout the model. So for our second model, we lowered the yield stress by 5 MPa to try and see if we could get a more mobile version of this model. And by mobile, we mean consistent subduction zones, something approximating plate tectonics like on Earth, where you have multiple subduction zones constantly working. And so at the beginning of this model, we still have sort of this period of episodic convection where we have periods of stagnant lid, and then mobility that is then shut off by some plume slab termination. And then once we hit about 8 billion years in the model, we transition into this mobile convection regime. And so here, there are several of these plume slab terminations that we see kind of happening quickly because there are multiple subduction zones. And I will show you what this looks like. So this is the second model where you'll have a period of sort of these episodic transitions for the first 8 billion years. And then in the last 7 billion, you'll have more mobility. And so you see this period of stagnant lid where you'll have these drips from the crust. Your subduction, it gets shut off. This is going to repeat a few more times. Until we hit roughly 8 billion years when our model stays mobile. So here you'll see this subduction zone will stop, but we immediately have others that start moving. And when this model gets more mobile, it also starts cooling the mantle because you have so much more of that slab material that's getting pushed into the mantle and cooling it down. So then, that bottom thermal boundary layer is having to like fight a little harder to reach the surface, have those plumes reach the surface. So that is what the overall convection looks like. But now we're going to look at these instances of terminations. So there's a couple of these that I'm going to show, and they have somewhat complicated dynamics. There's different versions of these interactions that we really see. So we're going to step through a couple of them. So this is from that first episodic model where there's a transition to stagnant lid convection immediately after that subduction shutoff. And so in this case, you'll see the plume sort of transects the slab and then will slide into the subduction zone. And so that is going to look like this, where you have your plume rise and cut off. From the beginning, you see it rise at the bottom. It gets immediately deflected by that subducting slab and sort of has to push around and then up and cross cuts the slab. And then as the plume head spreads out under the lithosphere, it pinches out that subduction zone. So this is what it looks like in the temperature, and this is the viscosity. So that's sort of one mode that we see. In another example, you still see a transition to stagnant lid convection after the shutoff, but you'll see a difference in the dynamics between the plume and subduction. So in this case, the plume is going to start from right here, and it's going to be sort of triggered by this subducting material. Rises up and then hits pretty much at the subduction zone, maybe a little bit behind, and cuts it off. And so we see that, there it is in full motion. And then in the viscosity, what you also see is other plumes following up in that reduced viscosity track as well. So in this case, it's still one of the episodic models, and it's showing essentially the plume striking directly behind the subduction zone. So in action, it rises and then hits right behind the subduction zone, cuts it off, and terminates subduction. And here in the viscosity as well, you can also see it's essentially joining some of these plumes to rise together to then go up and hit the surface. So this last example is from the mobile time in the model. And so the convection regime stays mobile after these periods of shutoff because there's multiple subduction zones present. There's going to be, a couple of instances of this plume slab termination, but we also see instances of plume subduction initiation as well in the model. So this is where it gets a little more complicated to see in the viscosity because the model is cooling. So the viscosity is rising, but here in the temperature, we see this subduction zone shut off, another sort of slides in. So this is sort of the first case where the slab on the right gets pinched off, but you have another slab. You see initiation happening around this plume head, where slabs start subducting. And you see another slab turn off while you also have more slabs being introduced. So these models started off pretty simple, but they end up getting pretty complicated dynamics. But one of the questions we have for this is what is causing this plume-driven subduction termination? What's sort of happening in the model that allows this to happen? So we looked at the models, the data that comes out of it, and sort of narrowed it down to two things. One is that all of these subducting slabs have been weakened by our damage rheology, meaning they all have a lower yield stress and more accumulated damage in them. This is essentially needs to be a precursor to these slab terminations. We see weakened slabs in instances where there isn't termination, but we don't see any non-weakened slabs have this sort of termination. So this is necessary, but does not only happen with termination. But the second thing we find as sort of a control on this is that these slabs tend to be younger. We find them that they're essentially thinner and warmer. There's no way in our model for us to measure the actual age of the subducting slab. So we are just inferring this from half-space cooling laws when we look at the internal temperature of the slab and the thickness. So this is showing yield stress in our models from the third termination example I showed. This is the scale over here. So this subducting slab has been fully weakened to 16 MPa. So we essentially allow the strain weakening to reduce the yield stress by 75%. So this model started at 65 MPa in the crust, and then this slab is fully weakened. And this is what it looks like in the total accumulated strain, which is showing essentially the damage in the model. So you have the most damage accumulated in sort of the top of that subducting slab. And then if you look lower down in the mantle, there's essentially less damage because of the heat component to our strain healing. And so if we want to look at the temperature contrast between the plumes and the slabs, the backdrop of this is the yield stress again. And this is looking at temperature contours in the slab and the mantle plume, which is right here. And so you can see the difference in temperature. And if you compare it back to where the damage is most accumulated, it is in the colder parts of the slab, which we're expecting. And so thinking about the sort of young versus old in terms of temperature, we've compared instances of termination versus non-termination, looking at the internal slab temperature as an analog for plate age. So the blue here is going to be the terminating cases, and the orange is the non-terminating cases. So here's our temperature, and we can see in the terminating cases, the internal temperature of the slab on average is about 200 degrees higher than these non-terminating cases. So this is kind of where we get the idea from. In terms of non-terminating cases, we're going to take a look at some of those. There is proportionally a lot more of these in our models compared to these terminating cases. There's, if I remember the numbers correctly, in the first model, 16 non-terminating interactions, and in the second model, there are 27 non-terminating interactions compared to 8 terminations in the first model and 10 terminations in the second model. So this happens more often. And in this first case, we'll see a couple interactions that don't lead to termination, where you have these plumes sort of sliding into the subduction zone, like that, and same in the viscosity. And you end up with a still strongly subducting cold slab. In the second example, these are still from the stagnant case, or the episodic case. So you'll see, you'll have plumes sliding in. This cross-cuts the slab, but is essentially not enough to terminate once the plume head reaches the surface. So there are, several instances of these throughout the models, even in the episodic case. And when we get to this third example that I'm going to show, this is in the mobile model. And so there's really a lot of these interactions going on. So it's kind of hard to parse them out, especially in the viscosity. It's more evident in the temperature. So you'll have, various interactions that don't lead to subduction at all in these mobile models. So we've looked at the dynamics of this, what it looks like in our models, and now we're kind of transitioning how we think about it from, a theoretical model to sort of the connections that it might have to Earth. So one of the things we thought about was the connection to early Earth tectonics and the transition from the sort of stagnant lid processes that we had back before plate tectonics started to this sort of transitional regime until we got to modern day plate tectonics. So it's reminiscent from the stagnant lid that we have. Our model also shows these sort of lower crustal drips, which are pretty characteristic of stagnant lid convection. And then this sort of transition into what we have today, we think might be reminiscent of that second model where we showed a transition from the episodic periods into the mobile convection. Another connection would be relation to sort of modern day tectonics and geology. There are several places we know of today that have some of these subduction plume interactions that we know about from tomography. Places like South America, Yellowstone, or China. A paper in 2015 looked at mantle plumes in the last 60 million years, and they identified 18 plumes within 1,000 kilometers of subduction zones, and also 4 plumes that directly interacted with subduction zones in the last 60 million years. And so just sort of loosely extrapolating that number back to maybe the beginning of plate tectonics, that's 200 potential plume subduction zone interactions, which isn't insignificant. And so if we're thinking about some of these present day interactions, one of them is the South American subduction. So we're focusing on sort of the middle to southern part of South America here. This area has a documented sort of slab hole, slab window, slab tear. There's a lot of terminology for it. And this is a conceptual model from Portner et al. 2017, looking at this area where he shows a plume sort of offshore of the subduction zone that has then taken advantage of the already present slab hole. So we did an interpretation of the tomography in South America looking at 3 transects. And so in A, we have the subducting slab here and presence of some sort of plume sort of laying on the bottom of that subduction zone. A little farther south, we see this plume starting to intrude where sort of this whole slab window is, breaking up that slab. And then farther to the south, we see sort of the end of the extent of that plume head. And so this isn't, directly termination or anything, but it is sort of evidence of these interactions that we see. Another place where we see these sort of interactions is in the Yellowstone plume in Western North America. So this is showing where the subduction of the Juan de Fuca plate is compared to the hotspot track of Yellowstone. And so this is a model from Liu and Stegman that we're trying to show how this slab tear might have happened and the influence of mantle flow in that model, looking back in time. And then this is a comparable conceptual model from Obrevsky looking at the same subduction zone, showing how the plume head influences the tear in this slab. It's obviously more complicated, but again, sort of evidence of those plume slab interactions. So conclusions from this work, we show that rising mantle plumes are capable of shutting off subduction under the right conditions when you have those weakened and young subduction zones. We connect this to possible connections to early Earth convection transitions, and sort of modern day subduction zones also show evidence of these plume slab interactions. Obviously, our models are 2D and they're rather simplified, so we might not see exactly what we've modeled in real life, but we think it does have implications for plume slab interactions and plate tectonics in the past as well. Thank you. I will take any questions.
I do have a question, Erin. So the difference between episodic and mobile convection. So what you change is just the yield stress from 65 to 60 MPa, right? Mm-hmm. So why just only 5 MPa just change completely like the dynamics of like convection?
Yeah, so essentially our models kind of sit on the edge of this transition from episodic to mobile convection. And this has kind of been modeled in a bunch of different people like Berkovici, Tackley, who do other mantle convection modelings, have sort of mapped out this parameter space where you'll get a transition between these convection regimes. And so between adding the damage to our models and then changing the yield stress even a little bit, our models are like sort of right on the edge. So just reducing the yield stress even a little bit kind of flipped it over into the mobile convection regime.
Okay, thank you.
Erin, this is Ian Dion. Larry Lover and I and colleague published a paper about 20 years ago on potential plume subduction zone interaction along the margin of Gondwanaland. I'd have to look at the timing of shutoff of the magmatism, but I think it's almost exactly what you're describing. The Permian arc shuts off. It looks as if the plume interacted with the downgoing slab to flatten it first, generating the Gondwanite orogeny well inland from the, as flat slab subduction related, well inland from the Gondwana Pacific margin, and then eventually broke through to form the Karoo-Farrar large igneous province, which immediately preceded Gondwanaland breakup. So I'll send you a PDF of the paper.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reminiscent of sort of what we're looking at in the South American subduction. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we've compared it with that one and with the Obretsky Yellowstone story. It looks very comparable, but luckily in the latest Paleozoic to early Mesozoic Gondwana case, you get the whole story strung out from the Permian into the Jurassic.
Yeah, I don't fully remember the timescales in the Permian to then, but for the timing in our model, we see these interactions happening usually for either around like 40 million to 60 million years. So is that like a similar timescale to what you see for Gondwana?
This would be over perhaps 120 million.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I'll send you the PDF of the paper.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. It may be like a novice sort of question, but the original models that you showed ran over, I think, 15 billion years. I was wondering if you could speak to a comparison of that Earth is only 4 billion years old. So how do you get like our current configuration in a shorter sort of amount of time?
Yeah, so part of the reason we ran our models for such a long time scale, that isn't comparable to Earth, is because we were looking at sort of these, like from here, these transitions. And so if it was going to be comparable to Earth, it would essentially, you would have only one of those transitions moving from stagnant lid into mobile convection. So like maybe for model 2, if you started here or here, had some stagnant lid period, that started being episodic and then became mobile. So it would happen on a shorter time scale. We were just looking at it longer because we want to see kind of how this plays out over time.
Yeah, thank you. This is sort of goes along with it. I think it was between the transitioning and non-transitioning, the temperature, like that was like 200 degrees different. Yeah, isn't that kind of cold? Like very cold for a slab temperature? Or is this like also just model specific instead of like Earth?
Yeah, it might end up being because of these models. it's not going to be the exact same sort of temperature profile as you're going to see on Earth, because again, this model is only involving bottom heating. So we might end up seeing colder slabs in general than if it was, realistic to Earth with internal heating in the mantle.
Cool. Yeah, thanks. That makes sense.
I do have another question. So like, I think like the idea of like, having like this slab plumes interaction is also like due to actually your damage rheology, right? That you have like this shut off, this termination of the subduction. Like if you, for example, you don't have this damage rheology, but you have like the usually type of rheology that usually most of the people are using, like what is gonna change? I mean, in that case, you probably don't have like termination or subduction, or we just because you kind of like do have like a weakening of the slab that you can have this kind of interaction and termination.
Yeah, so I did run some models not using the full damage rheology where we have strain weakening and strain healing. So I've looked at cases where it's like just plasticity is the rheology that you're using, or plasticity plus strain weakening. And so the differences there do come into sort of the damage part of the slab. You won't get as much slab weakening, and you also won't get this accumulated strain in the same sort of way if you're not using the damage rheology. I don't remember the exact numbers, but we did still see like plume slab interactions. And I think there were a few cases when you're using sort of plasticity and strain weakening where you do still get some of these terminations, but it doesn't happen anywhere near as frequently as using the full damage rheology.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Mark?
Very interesting. I apologize, I missed the first introduction and all, but the figure you got right in front of us, for example, I see a subducting slab descending deep into the earth, folding up multiple times, and it looks like it's the same thickness everywhere.
It's not exactly the same thickness everywhere. It's comparable at least maybe to the first 1,000 kilometers. But looking at, when you look at like viscosity or the temperature, it does tend to sort of thicken and start thermally diffusing when it gets to the lower mantle.
Okay. Well, I think it would depend on the rate that it's plunging down there. And obviously your model allows you to do that, but I guess I'm a little bit puzzled in terms of the definition of the lithosphere as a thermal boundary layer. And as the lower lithosphere is warming up as it's descending downwards, getting heated, it's going to be thinning in terms of its mechanical equivalency. And yes, I presume you've got your viscosity plot that can kind of show that effect. But once it's warming up as it's going down, I think it's more equivalent to the asthenosphere, and therefore losing its integrity. And I'm not sure what the rest of the asthenosphere, obviously this is the plate going down, but there is convection going on, circulation in the surrounding stuff, isn't there?
Yeah. Just pull up one of these. Well, at least in the mobile case, yes, there would be other, subducting slabs. But this is essentially what it would look like. So your 660 would be somewhere around here. So your subducting slab, once it gets past, it essentially, the temperature starts increasing. So it kind of, I wouldn't say it exactly thins just because of like the properties that we give it. But the temperature anomaly starts diffusing away while the slab is warming up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it definitely is a bit of a different way of thinking about, at least from the way I long-term had thought about what's going to be happening as the plates are descending downwards. The other next level of the question, though, is the issue of, maybe you said this in your introductory slides and I missed it, but the importance for oceanic lithosphere of the eclogitic transformation for the crust. Because that, I certainly would have thought that's where a major component of the negative buoyancy is, particularly once you're getting down there to 600 plus kilometers. Is that part of the model?
So not my model. You can implement like phase transitions where the specific minerals that will affect sort of the equations. I only have an imposed viscosity jump. So the viscosity in the lower mantle is lower than the asthenosphere. And I'm only using one composition throughout the entire model. So this is, very simplified. We're not including other mineral compositions for the mantle or for the crust. And there's also like no continental crust in it. So it is definitely a lot simpler.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess my intuition had always been about half of the negative buoyancy actually resides in the eclogization of the oceanic lithosphere. And you think about that going back into Precambrian time, and that has some implications if we start messing with the thickness of oceanic crust as a function of geologic time. So, well, very interesting. Obviously, numerical experiments give us a lot of insight into what's possible that's happened here. And this is very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? All right, then. Thank you all for coming. Next week, we're going to start our series of PhD talks for the discussion hour. So tune in the next couple of weeks if you want to see those.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.